so much, Ria. It's wonderful to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to share my thoughts here at this conference. My talk today will focus on the policy and regulatory fundamentals to approve medical research versus the regulatory requirements for the approval of big data research in health. These involve legal frameworks for both biomedicine and data protection that are not identical in their approaches. I will specifically focus today on the secondary use of health data for research. That means data that has been collected for the primary purpose of healthcare giving, patient care, by health organizations or insurers, and is then subsequently repurposed for data research. It may also be data that has been collected as part of a specific clinical trial and then repurposed for another data analysis. My key takeaway messages are as follows. The legal landscape for big health data research is very complex. Big health data research is different than clinical trial research, and individual consent is not necessarily the best support for data access. Some nations have created specific legislation to support the access to health data, permitting its secondary use, and they include privacy safeguards and alternatives to consent. And this is a step in a very good direction, yet the implementation is still challenging and international harmonization is still lacking. So imagine you are an AI company developing a virtual reality solution for a genetic disability. You wish to gain access to relevant patient data held by a sick fund, a health management organization, a hospital with expertise in this condition in one country. You wish to also partner with expert academic research from two different other countries. Or imagine you're a government coping with a pandemic and wish to base policy decisions on data and share it with others who can contribute analysis findings and hopefully solutions. So the COVID pandemic has definitely emphasized the crucial role that data collection, analysis, sharing, and dissemination on a large scale, population, nationwide, international scale, play for governments, academic institutions, and private sector businesses. And all were racing to advance scientific research to help combat the virus. Yet access to data remained a challenge for some. Regulation of the use of data and regulation of medical research serve us in building public trust in scientific and state institutions. There is a considerable background of norms and policy tools to interventional human health research, meaning clinical research involving the human body. They include the World Medical Association Helsinki Declaration from 1964, ethical principles for medical research involving human subjects, and also the 2000 amendment, including identifiable human material and data. The Helsinki Convention is addressed primarily to physicians, but recommended to others as well. And it acknowledges that medical progress is based on research that ultimately must include studies involving human subjects. Participation of subjects in the research is known as clinical trials, must usually be based on informed consent. This is also reflected in the Council of Europe Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine. So we've had an equation for many years. Medical research is essential and even constitutes an imperative that is part of serving our human rights to life and health. It involves the human body and should not be conducted without each person's informed consent. And this ethical process for approving research includes maintaining medical confidentiality and receiving the approval of the Helsinki Ethics Committee. Moving from medical research to data processing, in 1980, OECD guidelines laid out the principles of privacy protection to enable transport of data flows in a digital economy. Now, these apply to any type of personally identifiable data in any sector, be it health, finance, education, government services, e-commerce, etc. And a primary principle is the collection limitation principle. There should be limits to the collection of personal data. Data processing requires a legal basis, and any such data should be obtained by lawful and fair means. and where appropriate with the knowledge or consent of the data subject. And the EU General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, mandates this principle and many others, which apply firstly in the EU, but currently, as the GDPR has become very much a gold standard around the globe, in many other countries that have adopted similar laws. Now, the GDPR recognizes scientific research as an issue of prime interest to the public. For example, the recitals state that private sector company involvement in research is permitted, be it pharma companies or tech companies, and AI model development may be a legitimate purpose for using data. Explicit allowances are made for secondary use of personal data for scientific research in the GDPR. This opens the possibility of repurposing healthcare data for big data research and also repurposing clinical research data. But I wish to emphasize a significant attribute of big health data research. It is non-interventional in nature, and it does not involve the human body directly. It also generally includes much larger quantities of data on a lot more people and may call for non-health data to be added to the data set explored. In AI model development, when searching for signals, fishing for signals, this is especially true. And this may sway the emphasis from the Helsinki Convention and patient law's legal basis and approval duties and approval processes, and the interpretation given by members of Helsinki committees to the notion of consent, to the data protection notion of legal basis and consent. Now, since we are discussing health data, another set of rules in the GDPR apply. Health data is a special category of sensitive data, of which using is forbidden, but for several permitted purposes, such as substantial public interest in the area of public health, scientific research, but must be relied on a union or member state law that is dedicated to allowing this processing activity and is proportionate and includes safeguards. I'll just briefly mention that on the national level, legal frameworks governing secondary use of health care data for research are even more complex. They may include at least 3 more layers of laws and regulations, national privacy laws, patient privacy laws, public health regulation. In certain countries like the US and Australia, there's also a federal system that adds complexity with state and provincial laws providing additional layers of regulation. In England, the secondary use is also governed by common law, statutory law, government decisions, regulatory authority guidelines. And this definitely created a very complicated legal landscape. Now, do you remember that you're an AI company wanting to get access to data for research, or you're a government wanting to collect and share data with the private sector and academia to get support for COVID research, and you want to also share this knowledge with other countries? So in 2017, the OECD organization has recommended that member governments legislate data governance frameworks to facilitate the secondary use of health data for research directly. That means not relying purely on GDPR or data protection frameworks for the allowance to access health data for research, but create specific dedicated legislation on the national level that will permit this. And the goals were 2. The first goal was to advance the collection, standardization, aggregation, and access to big health data. This is due to problems of data quality, data linkage, and data standardization. And the second goal of the OECD guidelines was to streamline the legal and bureaucratic process of gaining access to data and collaborating in research while allowing multi-stakeholders and nations to collaborate. And in the past few years, countries around the world are charting new paths to seek the insights that health data can reveal, while at the same time respecting individual rights and specifically privacy. So at the Israel Tech Policy Institute, together with the Future of Privacy Forum, we conducted a survey and examined these emerging legal frameworks. We've looked at 8 countries. Some of them have laws on the, already in power. Some of them have drafts that are under discussion, policy discussions. We've looked at Australia, England, Finland, France, India, Ireland, Israel, and the United States. Now, on the macro level, we found commonalities across legal systems and regimes. Firstly, in permitting secondary use of healthcare data for research purpose under certain conditions, and in the types of conditions that include review by ethical boards, proper de-identification, or privacy technologies implemented, additional administrative, technical, and contractual safeguards. But on a closer look, there still remain significant nuances and ambiguities. Health data that may be used for big data research is defined quite broadly by most regulations and includes administrative data, insurance data, demographics, diagnosis, symptoms, prescriptions, immunizations, tests, results, environmental and social elements, and additional medical conditions. Now, legal frameworks typically extend the definition of secondary research to both academia, government, and pharmaceutical research, including pharmacovigilance, and even to product development and preventive medicine. So in 2019, in Finland enacted a law explicitly intended to clarify the legal basis for broader secondary use of healthcare and social care data. The law aims to encourage use of healthcare data for socially valuable purposes by enabling data users to have a one-stop shop for access requests to such data. The Finn authority the law has also created a new government agency, FinData, specifically tasked with collecting, managing healthcare data from numerous disparate sources, securing the data, and efficiently processing access requests from researchers. France has a similar model. They also created a central health data hub and catalog managed by a dedicated authority. The application for data access is to the authority, and the ethical board decides on the existence of a public interest in the research. After that, the National Data Protection Authority of France, the CNIL, will be involved either as an approval authority, or if an applicant can declare that they comply with a published reference methodology of the CNIL, the project can proceed even without the CNIL's approval. Other countries, such as England and Australia, rely on an existing national data repository of patient records and allow access to that under those new laws. So to sum up, components of the new national policies may include a health data authority, a health data hub or catalog, or both, health data application process, health data governance board, and health data secure research platform that will enable researchers to work on that platform. Now, let's go over the complementary safeguards shared by these regulations. So firstly, in place of consent, approvals or waivers by ethics boards or regulators. So all legal frameworks explored in this project generally empower patients to authorize healthcare data research with their explicit consent. But this is, however, a basis that may often be infeasible, especially where data is used for purposes unexpected at the time of collection, or for population level research, or longitudinal data research, where some of the people are not with us anymore to give their consent. Furthermore, it is important to note that the European Data Protection Board has advised that the informed consent that ethics committees often require for research data sharing may not always align with the legal basis under data protection law, due to concerns that in a clinical trial relationship, data protection consent may not be freely given. So another legal basis other than consent is required under data protection law for access to the same research data. And the European Data Protection Board has recently reiterated that consent for clinical trials and consent for data processing are not the same and should not be confused. So all countries surveyed, therefore, also permit data research on other grounds and with additional safeguards, such as ethical reviews, pseudonymization of the data, security measures, contractual agreements. So for example, in the US, an institutional review board or privacy board can award a waiver of consent if the use or disclosure of healthcare data involves no more than minimal risk to the privacy of individuals, and that the research could not practicably be conducted with patient consent or without access to the use of the data. In Australia, research is permitted where obtaining consent is impracticable. The information is necessary for the research. The research outcome is relevant to public health or public safety, and the Human Research Ethics Committee has approved the project, and with sufficient de-identification deployed. Under Irish law in Ireland, a data controller seeking an alternative to consent must apply to a special central committee to assess whether the public interest in conducting health data research significantly outweighs the interest in obtaining patient consent. Similarly, in France, a board decides if the research purpose is in the public interest. English law authorizes secondary use of healthcare data if a researcher shows that obtaining patient consent is not practical and that anonymized information cannot be used. The activity has a medical purpose, such as medical research, that has received ethics approval from a research ethics committee, and the activity is in the public interest or in the interest of improving patient care. And there are also countries such as France, England, and Finland that provide patients with the right to opt out from having their health data analyzed for scientific research. So I remind you that we're talking about quite large, sometimes national, sometimes government created and managed or health organization managed public databases. And access to researchers is granted without people's consent. Now, these countries give people the right to opt out from this processing of the data, even though consent is not sought after because there is another legal basis for the processing. Now, critics argue that in some cases, general opt-out rights could unintentionally skew research results, injecting bias into the public health decision-making or into machine learning algorithms. A conceptual problem also arises since opt-out is a part of individual consent model. If consent was waived, why is there an opt-out awarded? In some countries, to be approved without consent, research must also be deemed to be in the public interest, and these are also challenging definitions that differ between geographies and cultures. Shortly, de-identification as a technological safeguard. This was presented, I assume, during this day and will continue to be demonstrated. So under most data protection frameworks, anonymized data is not subject to legal protections. For data to be considered anonymized, some countries require that re-identification be practically impossible. Others accept anonymization if re-identification is unlikely or risks are remote. These are differing definitions that, from a policy and regulatory perspective, create different frameworks for users. So France and Finland are guided by stricter de-identification standards according to the European Data Protection Board. The UK has historically taken the position that de-identification risk can be remote, but may be changing, aligning with EDPB guidance. Under US law, data that is de-identified under HIPAA privacy rule is no longer considered protected health information, and the bar is not set very high for this process of de-identification. Risk analysis for re-identification and metrics to evaluate the strength of pseudonymization are not readily available and are quite case dependent. Speaking as an ex-policymaker, this is something I would very much like to have when making these policy decisions. Can a professional from the computer science, mathematics, statistics profession give us policymakers some metrics or some evaluation of how strong is the anonymization? I'm not sure that is feasible. There are additional safeguards required by these regulations. For lack of time, we'll not go into all of them, but they include a lot of security measures, data sharing agreements that require researchers comply with very strict information government and forbid the re-identification of the data. Data impact assessments are sometimes required, data minimization is required, and I will not go into the cross-border data transfers problem, but that for international cooperations, the transfers of data between borders is very challenging in data protection frameworks. And I will just jump right ahead and conclude that evidently the need for health data for research is clear. Protecting individual rights to ensure trust and safety is also paramount. The legal landscape for big health data research is very complex. Big health data research is different than clinical trial research, and individual consent is not necessarily the best support for data access. Some nations have created specific legislation to support access to health data, permitting its secondary use. They include privacy safeguards alternative to consent. This is a step in a very good direction, yet implementation is still challenging, both from a national perspective and international harmonization of these frameworks is still lacking. So thank you very much for your attention. And Ria, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Limor. There is a question. The previous speaker mentioned the importance of global health research. You highlighted the importance of the legal frameworks on national research. So how can we combine these national research frameworks and promote global health research?
I think that firstly, through organizations such as the OECD or other international government organizations, since those are the venues to build collaborations, to create collaborative frameworks that will enable the larger scale international cooperation. I think that this is very much a policy decision for politicians. So sometimes when there's a will, there's a way. I think that it will require that both privacy professionals and health researchers come together with technology experts that can provide privacy technologies or privacy enhancing solutions in order to create a mechanism that will work on the international stage.
Okay, thank you. Another question about the value of the recent initiatives on COVID-19 showed that how fast researchers can react and how they can accelerate collaboration in building projects that helped a lot with this situation. What are the lessons learned for the legal researchers? How the legal researchers took lessons from this experience?
I think that firstly, the pandemic has absolutely brought to our attention that when we're discussing these very complicated law and technology issues, there are several human rights that are involved and should be taken into consideration. So this international state of emergency has brought together both our human right to health and to life, our human right to to our livelihood, to our security, to our economic welfare, and our human rights to privacy and freedom and liberties and equalities. And this requires legal professionals to make these complex combinations of interests and considerations and give each of them the right place at this time. And sometimes I think it's not only a legal question. So sometimes the law provides a spectrum of interpretation possibilities, and it's actually a policy decision of policymakers or of elected officials what is the right balance that they wish to decide on for their country or for their group of nations.